The world had changed, irrevocably, since the day the virus began to spread. It started in small cities, then it spread like wildfire, swallowing entire countries before anyone had time to react. The dead had risen, taking over everything, leaving a hollow wasteland where life once flourished. What was once a bustling metropolis was now a ghost town, inhabited only by the undead, whose hunger for human flesh knew no bounds. The remaining survivors had banded together in pockets, scattered across the broken world. Among them was a group of survivors, ordinary people who had turned extraordinary in their struggle for survival. Among them was Captain Mara Donovan, a seasoned leader who had been fighting since the first day the outbreak began. Mara was no stranger to loss, but the fire in her eyes never wavered. She had one goal: to reclaim what was lost. To restore humanity's dignity and honor. In a hidden bunker far from the chaos of the ruined cities, Mara sat with a small group of soldiers and civilians, huddled around a table with maps, photographs, and intelligence reports. The room was dimly lit by candles, their flickering glow casting long shadows on the walls. The only sound was the steady drip of water from the pipes overhead and the occasional rustle of paper as the survivors debated their next move. "We can't keep hiding forever," Mara said, her voice steady but laced with urgency. "The undead are growing in number. They're organized. They're spreading across the country, and if we don't take a stand now, we'll lose everything. Humanity is running out of time." A grim silence filled the room as the survivors exchanged uneasy glances. Some looked hopeful, others doubtful. The weight of Mara's words hung heavy in the air. No one had ever dared to launch a full-scale counteroffensive against the zombies. The survivors had been surviving, barely, but no one had ever planned to reclaim the Earth. It seemed an impossible task. "I understand the fear," Mara continued. "But we've seen the zombies adapt. They're learning. We don't know how, but they're getting smarter. We need to hit them where it hurts. We need to take back our cities, one by one. We need to be the spark that ignites the rebellion." There was a moment of hesitation before a voice spoke from the back of the room. It was Alex, a former scientist-turned-soldier, who had seen firsthand the horrors of the virus and had watched his colleagues fall to the undead. "Captain, I don't disagree with you," Alex said, his voice shaking with emotion. "But have you seen what's out there? The zombies are evolving. They're not like the mindless creatures we fought in the beginning. They're becoming coordinated. More deadly. If we try to fight back now, we risk more lives than we can afford to lose." Mara's gaze hardened. She knew the risk. But she also knew that without action, humanity was doomed. "We don't have the luxury of waiting. Every day we stay hidden is another day they grow stronger. We've been living in fear for far too long. It's time we take back control." The survivors fell into a heavy silence again, each one processing the weight of Mara's words. The task ahead was daunting. The zombies had taken everything, from their homes to their families. Yet, Mara saw something in her companions that had been absent for far too long, a flicker of hope. The world wasn't over yet. Not if they could unite. Not if they could fight back. "We'll need a plan," Alex said, his voice resolute. "If we're going to take this fight to them, we need to know everything about their movements. Their weaknesses. We need to gather intel and build our forces." Mara nodded. "Agreed. The first step is gathering a strike force. We'll need weapons, resources, and a way to communicate with other survivor groups. We can't do this alone." Outside the bunker, the wind howled, as if the earth itself was warning them. But in the hearts of those gathered, there was no turning back. The rebellion had begun. The cold wind howled outside the makeshift bunker, as if nature itself was whispering secrets of a dying world. Inside, the flickering candlelight illuminated the faces of the survivors, each worn and weathered by the trials they had endured. Mara stood at the head of the table, her eyes unwavering as she surveyed the group. They were all in. No turning back. "We need allies," Mara said, her voice filled with resolve. "There are other survivor enclaves out there, scattered, hiding, just like us. We can't fight this war alone. We need to unite them. We need to send out the call. Her words hung heavy in the air. Some of the survivors nodded, recognizing the importance of reaching out. Others, however, looked unsure. Alex, the former scientist who had become a key strategist for the group, raised an eyebrow. Uniting them won't be easy, he warned. There are factions out there, factions that won't trust us. People who've become so cynical they've lost all hope. And you have to consider the risk. The zombies could be close to any one of these groups. Sending a call could lead them straight into the jaws of danger. Mara's jaw tightened, but she knew the risks. What good was survival if humanity no longer had the strength to fight back? They had to take risks if they were going to have a chance. She locked eyes with Alex, her voice firm. We have to try, Mara said. If we sit here waiting for them to come to us, we'll never stand a chance. We're going to create a network. We'll use the old radio towers, the ones scattered across the country, to send out a message. A call for unity. There was a long pause as the survivors considered the magnitude of what she was suggesting. Reaching out, relying on old technology that hadn't been used in years, was a risky gamble. But it was their only option. One of the survivors, a former mechanic named Eddie, spoke up. I can get the old radio equipment working, he said, his voice quiet but determined. It's a long shot, but I know the tech. We might be able to reach some of the old networks. Mara smiled, a flicker of hope igniting in her chest. Good. We'll make it work. But we can't wait too long. The undead aren't sitting idly by. They're moving, and they're learning. Every moment counts. With the plan in motion, the group split into teams to gather supplies and scout out the old communication towers. As they prepared to head out, there was a brief moment of quiet reflection in the room. No one said it aloud, but they all knew the stakes. If they failed, it would be a death sentence, not just for them, but for the entire human race. Outside, the world had fallen into an eerie stillness, the kind of silence that only the apocalypse could bring. The only sounds were the distant groans of the undead wandering aimlessly through the desolate streets. Mara gathered her things, preparing for the long and dangerous journey ahead. But something inside her stirred, something deep, primal, and powerful. A feeling she hadn't had since before the outbreak: hope. Part 3, The Dangerous Journey. The survivors began their journey, trekking through the broken remains of what was once a thriving civilization. The roads were littered with abandoned vehicles, long since looted of any useful supplies. The land was barren, the air thick with the smell of decay. It felt as though they were walking through the bones of the world itself. Mara led the way, keeping a watchful eye on the surroundings. The world had become a maze of dangers, both the living and the dead. She couldn't afford to let her guard down, not for a second. Eddie worked tirelessly to fix the radio equipment as the team moved forward. The old technology was a patchwork of scraps, but Eddie's skills were unmatched. He tinkered with wires and dials, muttering to himself as he tried to get the system up and running. Alex walked beside Mara, his eyes scanning the horizon. Do you really think this will work? He asked, the doubt still present in his voice. Mara didn't hesitate. We have to make it work. If we don't reach out, if we don't unify the survivors, we're lost. It's our only chance. As the team reached the first communication tower, they found it in a state of disrepair. Overgrown with vines and rusted with age, the tower was a symbol of the world they had once known, forgotten, abandoned, and left to rot. Eddie wasted no time, setting to work on the broken equipment. As the minutes passed, the tension in the air grew. The sound of distant groans reached their ears, the unmistakable noise of the undead closing in. The survivors knew they had little time before the tower was swarming with zombies. We need to hurry, Mara urged, her voice low. We're not alone out here. Suddenly, a faint crackle came through the radio equipment. The survivors held their breath. Was it working? This is it, Eddie whispered. He adjusted the dials, and the crackling grew louder, until a voice came through the static. Hello? Is anyone out there? Mara's heart skipped a beat. The call had been answered. The rebellion was beginning. Let me know if you'd like to continue with the next parts. The radio signal crackled as the survivors gathered around the makeshift station, their hearts racing in anticipation. Eddie, the former mechanic who had managed to coax the ancient equipment back to life, held his breath as the voice came through the static once more. "Hello? Is anyone out there?" The words, faint but unmistakable, ignited a spark of hope in Mara's chest. For the first time in a long while, she felt the weight of her responsibilities begin to shift. This was more than just a fight for survival. This was a chance to rebuild, to rally the scattered remnants of humanity against the undead tide. "Who is this?" Mara asked, leaning into the radio with urgency. "This is Captain Mara Donovan, a survivor in the uprising. We're looking to unite the scattered enclaves of survivors. Are you with us?" There was a long pause, the static filling the silence. Then, the voice returned, distorted but clearer this time. "I'm Sergeant Kyle Brooks. We've been listening for signals like yours. We're holed up in a secure location, but we can't stay here much longer. The undead are closing in. We need help." Mara's pulse quickened. Kyle's words were a confirmation of what she had feared. Time was running out. The enemy was not just growing in numbers, but adapting, learning. They couldn't afford to waste another moment. "Where are you?" Mara asked, her voice steady despite the adrenaline surging through her veins. Kyle's voice was filled with both relief and desperation. "We're in what used to be a military base, about 200 miles southeast of your location. We have weapons, supplies, but we need more manpower. If you can get to us, we can make a stand. We've got a plan, but we need you." Mara exchanged a glance with Alex. The stakes had just risen. If they could link up with Kyle's group, they could form the nucleus of the rebellion. But the journey would be treacherous, especially with the undead roaming the roads. "We'll head your way," Mara said, her voice filled with determination. "But we need to move fast. Stay on high alert and keep the comms open. We'll contact you once we're close." The radio went silent, and the survivors fell into a tense, expectant quiet. Mara looked around at the group, their faces drawn and tired. The journey ahead was going to be grueling, but there was no turning back now. They had to succeed. "We leave at first light," Mara ordered, breaking the silence. "Get some rest while you can. We'll move out before the undead get too active." As the survivors dispersed to prepare, Mara stood alone, staring out into the darkened landscape. She could feel the weight of their mission pressing down on her. The world was on the brink of collapse, but maybe, just maybe, this was their chance to turn the tide. The journey to the military base was fraught with dangers. Every step felt like a gamble, every decision carrying the weight of life or death. They moved cautiously, sticking to the shadows and avoiding the main roads where the undead were most likely to roam. But the further they traveled, the more they realized just how vast the scope of the apocalypse had become. By the time they reached the outskirts of what was once a thriving town, it was clear that the undead weren't their only problem. The remnants of human civilization had fractured, leaving behind scavengers and marauders who had no loyalty but to themselves. The world Mara knew was gone, replaced by a harsh and unforgiving wasteland. "This place gives me the creeps," Alex muttered as they crouched behind an abandoned car, keeping low. "It's too quiet. Like it's waiting for something." Mara nodded, her eyes scanning the street ahead. The silence was unnerving, but it wasn't the kind of quiet that signaled safety. It was the kind of silence that preceded disaster. "We stick to the plan," Mara said, her voice firm. "No unnecessary risks. Keep moving." As they made their way through the town, a distant growl echoed from an alleyway. The unmistakable sound of the undead. Mara held up her hand, signaling for everyone to stop. The group froze, listening as the growls grew louder. "They're close," Eddie whispered, his eyes wide with alarm. Mara crouched low, motioning for the group to scatter into the nearby buildings for cover. She glanced at Alex, who was already reaching for his weapon, a rusted but still functional rifle. She gave him a nod, signaling that they were prepared for what was coming. The undead emerged from the alley, their lifeless eyes scanning the street. They moved slowly, their jagged movements almost robotic. But Mara could see the shift in their behavior. Something had changed. They weren't just aimlessly wandering anymore. They were hunting. Her heart pounded in her chest as she watched the zombies draw closer. It was time to act. "We take them out quietly," Mara instructed. "No noise." With practiced precision, the survivors began to pick off the undead one by one, using knives and melee weapons to avoid attracting more of them. The fight was swift but brutal. Every swing, every strike had to count. When the last of the zombies fell, Mara exhaled, her body tense with adrenaline. They had survived another encounter, but the feeling of dread still lingered. "We need to keep moving," she said, her voice low and urgent. "If they've started hunting, it means we're running out of time." The survivors didn't hesitate. They knew what was at stake. "Let me know if you'd like to continue with Part 5. As the survivors continued their journey, the air seemed to grow thicker, more oppressive. The world around them had changed. It no longer felt like the place they once knew. The remnants of civilization were just shadows, like ghosts of a forgotten era. Abandoned buildings, decaying vehicles, and empty streets painted a grim picture of humanity's fall from grace. But it wasn't just the destruction that haunted them, it was the silence. For days now, they hadn't encountered any other survivors. The occasional rumble of distant thunder or the low growls of zombies kept them on edge, but the overwhelming quiet was suffocating. Where had everyone gone? Mara pushed the unsettling thoughts to the back of her mind. The mission was clear. They had to reach Sergeant Kyle's group. They couldn't afford to stop and wonder what was happening to the world, they needed to act. As night began to fall, the team set up camp in an old factory on the outskirts of a long-abandoned industrial park. The building's rusted skeleton creaked in the wind, and the smell of mildew filled the air. The survivors worked in unison to secure the area, fortifying entrances and setting up makeshift traps around the perimeter. Eddie, who had been on edge for most of the journey, kept fiddling with his weapons and checking the radio. The equipment had been holding up, but Mara knew it was only a matter of time before something malfunctioned. The radio had been their lifeline, their connection to any other survivors still out there. "I don't like this place," Eddie muttered, his voice tense as he checked the radio one last time. "Too quiet. I keep hearing things." "I know," Mara said, her voice steady. She stepped closer to Eddie, glancing out the cracked windows. "But we need to rest. Tomorrow, we move out early. We're close, I can feel it." The survivors huddled around a fire they'd made in the center of the factory, the flickering flames casting long shadows across the room. They ate in silence, each of them lost in their own thoughts. The unease that had been building since they left the bunker seemed to reach its peak now. Mara could sense the growing tension in the air. It wasn't just the weight of their mission that pressed on their minds, it was the realization that they had reached the point of no return. They had gone too far to turn back. The world was closing in on them, and the undead were just one part of the storm they would have to face. Suddenly, a loud crash echoed through the factory. The survivors snapped to attention, their hands reaching instinctively for weapons. The sound had come from the far side of the building. Mara motioned for the group to stay quiet, her instincts kicking into overdrive. She signaled for Alex and Eddie to follow her as they moved cautiously toward the source of the noise. They crept through the dimly lit corridors of the factory, the air thick with the scent of dust and decay. Every step they took seemed to echo in the silence, amplifying their sense of vulnerability. Mara's hand tightened around her weapon, the familiar weight offering little comfort. As they turned a corner, they saw the source of the noise, a lone zombie stumbling through a gap in the wall. It was an older one, its decayed body barely holding together. But it wasn't the zombie that caused Mara to freeze. It was the sight behind it. A group of survivors, real survivors, not zombies, had set up camp in the far corner of the factory. They were living off of scavenged supplies, their makeshift shelters scattered haphazardly. But what caught Mara's attention the most was the armed man standing guard at the entrance. The survivors weren't alone. and the man guarding them had a look of desperation in his eyes. Mara motioned for the group to stay hidden. She could feel the tension rising. The man with the guard wasn't acting like someone simply trying to survive, he was watching, waiting for something. Something that Mara couldn't quite place. Without warning, the guard spun around, his weapon aimed directly at the group. Mara's heart skipped a beat, but she remained calm. She signaled for the others to stay still, not wanting to provoke a fight. The guard's eyes narrowed as he scanned the shadows. "Who's there?" he called out, his voice rough and hoarse. "Come out, now." Mara stepped into the light, raising her hands in a peaceful gesture. "We're not here to cause trouble. We're survivors. We're looking for help." The guard lowered his weapon slightly, but his posture remained tense. "Help?" he scoffed, his voice tinged with bitterness. "Help doesn't come in these times. Only betrayal. And if you've got any intentions of taking what's mine, you'll regret it." Mara held his gaze, her eyes unflinching. "We don't want anything but information," she said calmly. "We're trying to reach a group of survivors, Sergeant Kyle Brooks and his team. We've made contact over the radio. Do you know where they are?" The guard hesitated, his brow furrowed as he considered her words. The tension in the room thickened. It was a gamble to trust this man, but they had no other choice. "I know of Kyle," the guard said at last, his voice quieter. "But getting to him? That's a different story. There are people out there who will kill you for that kind of information. And not just zombies." Mara's heart sank. This wasn't going to be as easy as she thought. The clock was ticking, and now, the path to their salvation had grown even more treacherous. The guard's words echoed in Mara's mind as she stared at him, trying to gauge whether he was bluffing or speaking the truth. His eyes were cold, filled with the hardened suspicion of someone who had survived too long in a world that no longer had any room for trust. "I'm not here to make enemies," Mara said, keeping her voice steady. "We just need to get to Sergeant Kyle. If you know where he is, we need that information." The man's eyes shifted, flicking over to Alex and Eddie, as if weighing the possibility of a threat. He clearly wasn't used to visitors, especially not strangers like them. Finally, after a long, tense silence, he spoke again, his voice quieter this time. "If you want to make it to Kyle, you'll need more than luck," the guard said. "There are people out there who will stop at nothing to get their hands on anything useful. They'll kill for a can of food, let alone the coordinates to a well-armed group." Mara's stomach twisted. The risk was greater than she had anticipated. She'd known the world had changed, but this was different. This was a war of survival between the living, not just between humans and zombies. People had become as dangerous as the undead. "So what's your advice?" she asked, refusing to show the doubt creeping into her thoughts. "Get on your knees," the guard said, his tone turning dark. "Because if you think you're walking out of here without a price, you're wrong. Nothing is free anymore. Not even information." Mara's blood ran cold. It was a familiar tactic, one that many survivors had resorted to in the early days of the apocalypse, ensuring they held power over others through fear and manipulation. But Mara was no stranger to this kind of game. She had learned to read people in ways she hadn't thought possible before the outbreak. She stepped forward, her voice hard. "You think I'm going to kneel for information? You're mistaken." For a moment, the guard didn't move. The tension between them felt suffocating. But then, something in his eyes shifted, and he lowered his weapon. "You're not as stupid as you look," he said, the edge in his voice softening slightly. "All right. You're right. If you want to make it to Kyle, you need to know what you're walking into. But I'm telling you, nothing is guaranteed out there. Not anymore." The man looked around the room, then gestured for Mara and the others to come closer. He motioned to a cracked map pinned on the wall, a map that had seen better days. "The way to Kyle is through the wasteland," the guard said, pointing to a marked area on the map. "That's where the real danger lies. The undead are everywhere, but there are worse things out there, people who've turned into something other than human." Mara leaned in, her eyes scanning the map. The wasteland was a region she'd heard whispers about but had never dared venture near. It was a place where human survival was a constant struggle, and those who lived there had lost any semblance of compassion or humanity. There's a group of raiders that controls the region, the guard continued. They've become something else, something savage. They call themselves the Hunters. They'll attack anyone who comes close. They use the zombies as bait, herd them like cattle to trap anyone who strays too far. Mara's mind raced as she processed the information. The threat of the Hunters was worse than any undead encounter they had faced so far. They weren't just surviving, they were actively hunting the living. The group needed to find a way around them, but Mara wasn't sure how much longer their luck could hold out. If we want to make it to Kyle, the guard said, his voice growing grim, you'll need to pass through the wasteland. But that's where the danger is at its worst. The Hunters aren't the only problem. The undead, they're evolving. They've learned to move in packs, to work together. They're becoming smarter. And when you're not paying attention, they strike. Mara felt a knot tighten in her stomach. This wasn't just about survival anymore. They were stepping into a battlefield where the rules of the world had changed, where every decision had a ripple effect that could be fatal. We'll make it through, Mara said, her voice laced with determination. But I need to know one thing. Why are you helping us? What's in it for you? The guard's eyes flickered, a brief flash of hesitation crossing his face before he masked it with a smirk. Let's just say I've got my own reasons for wanting to see the Hunters taken down. They've taken something from me. Something important. Before Mara could ask more, the sound of footsteps echoed from behind them, and the guard's expression shifted into one of alertness. He turned quickly, his hand reaching for his weapon again. Get down, he hissed, his voice urgent. The survivors scrambled into position, weapons drawn as the sound grew louder, closer. It wasn't the groan of undead, but the unmistakable click of boots on metal, human footsteps. Mara's heart raced as she signaled for her team to take cover behind the nearest stacks of abandoned crates. The last thing they needed was another confrontation, especially one that could jeopardize the fragile alliance they had just formed. The guard's eyes were wide with fear, a cold sweat glistening on his forehead. It's them, he whispered. The Hunters. The tension in the air was palpable. Mara could feel her heartbeat thundering in her chest, matching the heavy footfalls growing louder as they neared the factory. The guard's warning about the Hunters seemed all too real now. These weren't just another group of desperate survivors, they were predators. And they were closing in on them. Mara signaled to Alex and Eddie, her eyes locked on the shadows creeping along the edges of the factory. They had to act fast, or they'd be trapped. The survivors quickly dispersed, each taking a position that would give them the best advantage. Eddie pressed himself against a rusted support beam, his breathing shallow as he gripped his rifle, while Alex crouched behind a stack of crates, his face pale with fear but determined to protect their group. Mara turned to the guard, who had already slipped into the shadows with the practiced ease of someone who had spent far too many nights evading death. Do you have a plan? She whispered urgently, her hand still gripping her weapon, her eyes scanning the factory's dim corners. The guard didn't answer immediately. He seemed distracted, his gaze flickering back to the advancing footsteps. A bead of sweat dripped down his forehead. I can't fight them, he muttered, almost to himself. But you might be able to. Mara didn't like the way he said that. It wasn't just the fear in his voice, it was the sense of finality that hung in the air, as if he had already resigned himself to the idea that this could be their last stand. Suddenly, the factory door burst open with a violent crash. A figure silhouetted against the pale light of the outside world stepped inside. The first hunter had arrived. His outline was monstrous, tall, broad-shouldered, with a menacing presence that seemed to suck the air out of the room. His clothes were torn, and his face, or what remained of it, was covered in bloodstains, his eyes gleaming with cold malice. Mara instinctively raised her weapon, ready to fire. But just as she took aim, another figure appeared in the doorway, then another, and another. The Hunters were here. They had found them. The guard took a step back, his voice low and panicked. It's too late. We're not getting out of this one. Mara's mind raced. She had to stay calm. They had to do something. With the hunters closing in from all sides, it was no longer about reaching Sergeant Kyle. It was about surviving this fight and making it out alive. The first hunter let out a low growl, his eyes scanning the room as if searching for prey. He was large, but Mara had seen bigger. What made him more dangerous was his confidence, the way he moved with purpose, as if he already knew he had the upper hand. "You're not the first to try and stand up to us," the hunter's voice boomed, a cruel, mocking laugh escaping his lips. "And you won't be the last. You think you can take back the earth? It's already ours." Mara gritted her teeth. She didn't have time for his taunts. She knew that if they didn't strike first, they'd never get another chance. The silence was shattered by the deafening crack of gunfire. Alex fired first, catching one of the hunters off guard, his shot landing in the man's shoulder. The hunter staggered back, but he didn't go down. Instead, he let out an enraged roar, charging forward. Mara didn't hesitate. She opened fire, her bullets tearing into the second hunter, but it barely slowed him down. The hunters were more than just men, they had been changed, mutated by the apocalypse into something more dangerous. They were faster, stronger, and relentless. The factory turned into a chaotic battleground as gunfire and the shrill cries of the hunters filled the air. The sound of bodies slamming into the ground, the rattling of weapons, and the harsh shouts of the survivors were the only things that could be heard over the chaos. Mara took a deep breath, focusing on the immediate danger. She needed to keep her team alive. That was the only priority. She fired another round, this time hitting the third hunter in the chest. But he didn't fall, he just kept coming, faster now, a predator in every sense of the word. Eddie, firing from his position behind the crates, managed to take down the fourth hunter. His breath was heavy, his aim shaky, but his determination was unwavering. He could see the fear in the other's eyes, but there was no turning back now. One of the hunters lunged at Alex, knocking him to the ground with terrifying strength. Alex gasped, struggling to get free as the hunter's claws scraped across his shirt. Blood dripped from the wound, but Alex wasn't finished yet. With a burst of strength, he slammed his weapon into the hunter's face, disorienting him enough to break free. Mara moved quickly, rushing to Alex's side. "Get up," she shouted, pulling him to his feet. There was no time to waste. "We need to take them down now." But just as they regained their footing, the guard shouted from the far corner of the room, his voice frantic. "It's a trap." Mara barely had time to register the warning before she saw it. The rest of the hunters, a small army, were closing in on all sides. They had been outnumbered from the start, but now it was clear they were completely surrounded. The door had been closed behind them. Escape was impossible. Mara's heart raced as she scanned the room for any kind of exit. The survivors were fighting with everything they had, but the odds were quickly turning against them. There was only one option left. They had to fight to the death. The air in the factory grew thick with smoke, the acrid smell of gunpowder stinging Mara's nostrils. The sound of gunfire reverberated off the walls, mingling with the guttural roars of the hunters as they closed in from all sides. Mara's heart raced, but she knew there was no turning back now. This was it, the final stand. She could hear Eddie's ragged breathing behind her as he fired round after round at the advancing hunters. His shots were growing less accurate, the desperation evident in his movements. Alex, still reeling from the earlier attack, was struggling to get back on his feet, his legs unsteady but his resolve strong. Mara knew they had no more time to waste. They were running out of ammunition, and the hunters weren't slowing down. There had to be a way out. There had to be a way to survive. She glanced at the guard, who was still hiding in the shadows, his eyes wide with fear. "What now?" she demanded. "Do you have a way out? You've been here before. There has to be something we can use." The guard's face was ashen, but he didn't answer right away. His gaze darted around the factory, locking onto the heavy metal doors at the far end. His eyes flickered to the ceiling, where the rusted framework of an old catwalk loomed above them. It wasn't much, but it was their only chance. There, the guard muttered, pointing to the catwalk. If we can make it up there, we can get to the upper level. There's a hatch that leads outside. It's our only shot. Mara nodded without hesitation. Let's move. The plan was risky, dangerous even, but it was all they had. She signaled to Alex and Eddie, and they began to move toward the catwalk, their weapons raised and ready. The hunters, however, weren't going to let them leave that easily. The largest of the group, the one who had spoken earlier, lunged forward, his claws extended, a snarl curling on his lips. Mara barely had time to react as the hunter's massive form collided with her. She hit the ground hard, her breath knocked out of her. The hunter's claws raked through the air, narrowly missing her face as she rolled to the side, desperately trying to get back to her feet. "Keep moving," she shouted to Alex and Eddie as she scrambled for her weapon. Eddie turned and fired, hitting the hunter in the shoulder. The beast howled, momentarily stumbling back, but it wasn't enough to stop him. Mara's heart pounded as she pushed herself up, her legs unsteady as the weight of the situation bore down on her. They had to make it to the catwalk, or all hope would be lost. The fight was growing more frantic. The remaining hunters were closing in, their growls growing louder as they surrounded the survivors. Alex, still injured, limped toward the catwalk, his eyes focused on the distant hatch that promised freedom. But the hunters weren't giving them a moment's respite. Suddenly, Eddie let out a yell as one of the hunters lunged at him. He fired, but the beast was too close. Eddie was knocked to the ground, his rifle falling from his hands as the hunter pinned him to the cold factory floor. "No!" Mara screamed, rushing toward them. Without thinking, she grabbed a discarded metal pipe from the ground and swung it at the hunter's head. The blow landed with a sickening crunch, and the hunter staggered back, momentarily stunned. It was enough for Eddie to break free. "Get up!" Mara shouted, pulling Eddie to his feet. "We don't have time for this." The group was near the catwalk now, but the remaining hunters were closing in fast. They had to make it there, or they were done for. With one last push, they reached the catwalk's ladder. Alex went first, his hands shaking as he pulled himself up. Eddie followed quickly behind him, his breathing labored but his determination still burning strong. Mara reached the bottom of the ladder just as the first hunter lunged at her again. She fired a final shot, hitting him square in the chest, and then scrambled up the ladder, her heart pounding with adrenaline. As they reached the upper level, the catwalk creaked beneath their weight. They were almost there, just a few more steps to the hatch. But the hunter leader wasn't done yet. He had managed to climb after them, his eyes wild with fury. Mara reached the hatch first, slamming her hand down on the rusty lever that would open it. The sound of metal scraping against metal echoed through the factory. The hatch slowly creaked open, revealing the outside world bathed in the dim light of twilight. "Go, go, go," she shouted, pushing Alex and Eddie through the opening. The hunter was right behind them, but Mara didn't hesitate. She squeezed through the hatch just as the hunter lunged forward, his claws barely missing her. With a final push, she slammed the hatch shut behind her, cutting off the hunter's pursuit. The group stumbled into the open air, gasping for breath. They were outside the factory, surrounded by the eerie silence of the world beyond. But they weren't safe yet. The wasteland stretched out before them, a harsh and unforgiving landscape, but it was still their only way forward. Mara wiped the sweat from her brow, her hands trembling with the aftershocks of the fight. They had made it, barely. But now, the true battle for survival was only just beginning. "We're not done yet," Mara said, her voice grim but filled with resolve. "Kyle's still out there. And we're going to find him." Alex and Eddie nodded, their faces set with determination. The journey was far from over, but for the first time in a long time, they felt the faintest glimmer of hope. They had fought the darkness, and they had survived. But in the world they now lived in, survival was just the beginning. This concludes the Great Uprising, humanity's final fight to reclaim the Earth. Let me know if you need any revisions or new story outlines.